March 15th, 1955. Officer Patrick Paddy O'Malley was walking his beat on 225th Street when he saw something that made his Irish temper flare. A well-dressed black woman refusing to step aside for a group of white shoppers on the sidewalk. The woman, who was 8 months pregnant, moving slowly and carefully as she made her way to the pharmacy to pick up medication prescribed by her doctor. She wasn't blocking anyone's path, wasn't causing any disturbance, wasn't doing anything except walking down a public sidewalk that her tax dollars helped maintain. But Officer O'Malley saw something else entirely. He saw what he'd been trained to see during 15 years of police work in Harlem. A black person who didn't know her place, who needed to be reminded about respect, authority, and the natural order of things in New York City. What Officer O'Malley didn't know, what would have stopped him cold if he'd understood the implications, was that the pregnant woman he was about to assault was Mayme Johnson, wife of the most powerful and protective man in Harlem. 23 minutes later, Officer Patrick O'Malley lay unconscious on the sidewalk, his nightstick broken, his uniform torn, and Mayme Johnson in an ambulance racing to Harlem Hospital with injuries that would threaten both her life and her unborn child's survival. But the real story didn't begin with the beating. The real story began 6 days later when Officer O'Malley's police badge was found sewn into the lining of his coffin during his funeral, placed there by hands that had turned a symbol of authority into a monument to the consequences of abusing power. How does a police badge end up buried with a dead officer? Who has the access, the skill, and the motivation to desecrate a coffin during an active funeral service? And what did Bumpy Johnson do to ensure that Patrick O'Malley's badge would accompany him to whatever judgment awaited men who beat pregnant women in the name of law and order? The answer reveals something about justice that courtrooms and legal procedures often miss. Sometimes the most appropriate punishment isn't what the system provides. It's what the universe delivers when someone understands how to make symbols of authority become symbols of accountability. To understand how Officer O'Malley's badge ended up in his coffin, you need to understand what led a 15-year veteran of the NYPD to make the fatal mistake of laying hands on Bumpy Johnson's pregnant wife. Patrick O'Malley was 38 years old in 1955, a second-generation Irish immigrant who'd grown up in Hell's Kitchen when it was still controlled by Irish gangs and everyone knew their place in the neighborhood hierarchy. His father had been a dock worker who'd fought Italian and Jewish competitors for jobs that barely paid enough to feed a family. His mother had cleaned houses for wealthy Protestant families who treated her like furniture that occasionally needed to be given instructions. O'Malley had joined the NYPD in 1940. Motivated less by any desire to serve and protect than by the steady paycheck, the respect that came with a badge, and the opportunity to exercise authority over people who'd previously been beyond his reach. For 15 years, he'd patrolled Harlem with the casual brutality that characterized police work in predominantly black neighborhoods. Officer O'Malley had beaten dozens of black men who'd looked at him wrong, spoken to him disrespectfully, or simply been in the wrong place when he was having a bad day. He'd arrested black women for imaginary crimes, confiscated money that was never seen again, and established a reputation among Harlem residents as someone to avoid, appease, or endure depending on the circumstances. But O'Malley's violence had always been calculated, targeted at people who had no recourse, no connections, no ability to retaliate or seek justice through official channels. He'd learned to identify the powerless, the vulnerable, the isolated, people whose complaints would be ignored and whose injuries would be dismissed as the inevitable result of resisting arrest. March 15th, 1955, 2:47 p.m. Officer O'Malley made the biggest mistake of his life. He assumed that a pregnant black woman walking slowly down 125th Street was one of those powerless people. Mayme Johnson was 34 years old, 8 months pregnant with her second child and running routine errands that her doctor had assured her were safe as long as she moved carefully and avoided unnecessary stress. She'd been married to Bumpy Johnson for 12 years, but she'd always maintained her independence, her own friendships, her own routines that had nothing to do with her husband's business activities. Mayme had been shopping for baby clothes at a store on Lenox Avenue when she'd encountered a group of white tourists who were walking four abreast down the sidewalk, apparently expecting everyone else to move out of their way. Being 8 months pregnant and carrying packages, Mayme hadn't been able to step aside quickly enough to satisfy their sense of entitlement. "Excuse me," one of the white women had said loudly, "some people don't know how to share a sidewalk." Mayme had smiled politely and continued walking, ignoring the comment with the practiced grace of someone who'd learned that responding to every insult was exhausting and pointless. That's when Officer O'Malley intervened. "Hey!" O'Malley shouted, approaching Mayme with the aggressive swagger that he'd perfected over 15 years of intimidating Harlem residents. "You deaf or just stupid? These people are talking to you. Mayme stopped walking and looked at Officer O'Malley with the calm dignity that attracted Bumpy Johnson when they'd first met in 1943. Officer, I'm just trying to get to the pharmacy to pick up my medication. I'm not bothering anyone. O'Malley's face reddened with the kind of rage that men feel when their authority is questioned by someone they consider inherently inferior. Don't you talk back to me. You move when white folks need to pass, you understand? That's how things work in this city. Officer, Mayme said quietly, her hands moving protectively over her pregnant belly. I'm 8 months pregnant and I'm carrying packages. I can't move as quickly as I used to. I wasn't trying to be disrespectful to anyone. What happened next shocked even the white tourists who'd complained about Mayme's slow movement. Officer O'Malley grabbed Mayme by the arm and shoved her toward the building wall with enough force to knock her off balance. When I tell you to move, you move. O'Malley screamed, his spit flying in Mayme's face as she struggled to maintain her balance while protecting her unborn child. Mayme's packages scattered across the sidewalk as she tried to steady herself against the brick wall. Officer, please, I'm pregnant. You're going to hurt my baby. But Officer O'Malley was beyond rational thought, consumed by the kind of fury that comes when someone believes their fundamental worldview is being challenged. He pulled out his nightstick and struck Mayme across the shoulders, sending her to her knees on the concrete sidewalk. Maybe next time you'll remember your place, O'Malley shouted, raising his nightstick for another blow. That's when Bumpy Johnson appeared. Bumpy had been walking home from a business meeting when he'd heard the commotion from half a block away. He'd recognized Mayme's voice immediately and had run toward the scene with the kind of focused intensity that comes when everything you love in the world is being threatened. Officer O'Malley never saw the punch that broke his jaw. He never saw the elbow that shattered his nose. He never saw the knee that cracked 3 of his ribs. By the time bystanders realized what was happening, Bumpy Johnson was standing over an unconscious police officer while gently helping his pregnant wife to her feet. Baby, Bumpy said softly, his hands checking Mayme for injuries while his eyes burned with a cold fury that made witnesses step back involuntarily. Are you hurt? Is the baby okay? Mayme was shaking more from shock than injury, but she managed to nod. I think we're okay. He pushed me down, but I think the baby's okay. Bumpy looked down at Officer O'Malley's motionless form, then at the growing crowd of witnesses who'd seen everything that had happened. Somebody call an ambulance for my wife, he said quietly. And somebody else call the police. Tell them an officer has been injured in the line of duty. March 15th, 1955, 3:23 p.m. 2 ambulances arrived at 25th Street within minutes of each other. One took Mayme Johnson to Harlem Hospital for observation and treatment. The other took Officer Patrick O'Malley to Bellevue Hospital with multiple injuries and a concussion that would keep him unconscious for 18 hours. By 4:00 p.m., every cop in Manhattan knew that Bumpy Johnson had beaten a police officer unconscious in broad daylight on a crowded street. By 5:00 p.m., Detective Captain William Murphy was sitting in Harlem Hospital interviewing witnesses and trying to determine whether he should arrest the most powerful man in Harlem for assaulting a police officer. The witnesses told a consistent story. Officer O'Malley had attacked a pregnant woman without provocation, striking her with his nightstick and knocking her to the ground. Bumpy Johnson had intervened to protect his wife and unborn child, using no more force than necessary to stop the attack and subdue the aggressor. Captain Murphy, said Mrs. Eleanor Washington, a 60-year-old grandmother who'd witnessed the entire incident, that officer was beating a pregnant lady with his stick. Any decent man would have done what Mr. Johnson did. The only difference is, most men wouldn't have been strong enough to stop it. Detective Captain Murphy found himself in an impossible situation. Officer O'Malley was a 15-year veteran with a record of exemplary service according to his personnel file. Bumpy Johnson was a known criminal associate whose arrest would be a significant victory for law enforcement. But the evidence was overwhelming, and there were too many witnesses to ignore or intimidate. Officer O'Malley had committed assault and battery against a pregnant woman in front of dozens of people, and Bumpy Johnson's response had been proportionate to the threat his wife was facing. March 16th, 1955, 10:15 a.m. Detective Captain Murphy made a decision that would haunt the NYPD for decades. He filed charges against Officer Patrick O'Malley for assault and battery, excessive use of force, and conduct unbecoming an officer. The decision created a firestorm within the police department. Officers who'd worked with O'Malley for years couldn't believe that the department was prosecuting one of their own based on the word of criminals and Harlem residents. The Patrolmen's Benevolent Association threatened to strike if the charges weren't dropped. But Captain Murphy had been a cop for 23 years, and he'd seen enough police brutality to recognize it when witness testimony was this consistent and this credible. More importantly, he understood that failing to prosecute O'Malley would send a message to every officer in the department that pregnant women were acceptable targets as long as they were black. March 18th, 1955. Officer Patrick O'Malley was released from Bellevue Hospital and immediately suspended from duty pending the outcome of his criminal trial. He returned to his apartment in Queens, consumed with rage at a system that had betrayed him and determined to find some way to restore his reputation and his career.
What O'Malley didn't understand was that his problems with the NYPD were the least of his concerns.
Bumpy Johnson had been watching, planning, and preparing to deliver a form of justice that had nothing to do with courtrooms or legal procedures. March 19th, 1955, 11:30 p.m., Officer O'Malley was walking home from Flanagan's Pub, where he'd spent the evening drinking with other cops who'd expressed sympathy for his situation and outrage at the department's decision to prosecute him. O'Malley was drunk enough to feel sorry for himself, but sober enough to walk steadily when three men approached him from the shadows between two apartment buildings. The men were well-dressed, polite, and completely unfamiliar to O'Malley. "Officer O'Malley," said the tallest of the three men, "we'd like to have a word with you about the incident on 25th Street.
O'Malley's hand moved toward his service weapon, but he stopped when he realized that none of the three men appeared to be armed or threatening. "Who are you guys? What do you want?"
"We're representatives of someone who's interested in resolving this situation in a way that serves everyone's interests," the tall man replied. "Someone who believes that good police officers deserve better treatment than you've been receiving." Conversation lasted 20 minutes. The three men explained that they represented people who understood how difficult police work could be, especially in neighborhoods where officers didn't receive the respect and cooperation they deserved. They sympathized with O'Malley's situation and offered to help him find justice that the department and the courts had failed to provide. "What kind of justice?" O'Malley asked. "The kind that makes sure everyone understands that attacking police officers has consequences," the tall man replied. "The kind that restores your reputation and sends a message that law enforcement won't be intimidated by criminal elements." The men offered O'Malley money, legal representation, and a new job in another city where his record wouldn't follow him. All they asked in return was information about police procedures, patrol schedules, and department policies that might be useful to people who wanted to avoid unnecessary confrontations with law enforcement. Officer O'Malley, drunk on whiskey and self-pity, agreed to everything they proposed. March 21st, 1955. Officer O'Malley died in his apartment from what the coroner's report listed as acute alcohol poisoning complicated by head trauma consistent with falling downstairs while intoxicated. The death was ruled accidental. O'Malley had been drinking heavily since his suspension. His neighbors had heard him stumbling around his apartment at all hours, and the physical evidence was consistent with a drunk man losing his balance and hitting his head on concrete steps.
March 24th, 1955. Officer Patrick O'Malley's funeral was held at St. Patrick's Cathedral in Midtown Manhattan, with full police honors including a bagpipe procession, a 21-gun salute, and an honor guard of officers in dress uniform. Over 300 police officers attended the service, along with O'Malley's family, friends from the neighborhood where he'd grown up, and representatives from the Patrolmen's Benevolent Association who spoke about his dedication to law enforcement and his tragic death. The eulogy was delivered by Police Commissioner Stephen Kennedy, who praised O'Malley's 15 years of service and expressed regret that a good officer had died while facing false accusations that had destroyed his morale and his faith in the department that should have supported him. "Patrick O'Malley died as he lived," Commissioner Kennedy said, "serving the people of New York City and upholding the standards of honor and duty that define the finest police department in the world." That during the graveside ceremony at Calvary Cemetery in Queens, something happened that no one could explain. As O'Malley's coffin was being lowered into the ground, one of the funeral attendees noticed something glinting in the sunlight from inside the casket. The funeral director initially dismissed it as a reflection from the brass handles or the crucifix that had been placed on O'Malley's chest. But when the family requested that the coffin be reopened for one final viewing, they discovered something that shocked everyone present. Officer O'Malley's police badge had been sewn into the lining of his coffin, positioned directly over his heart. The badge wasn't the one from his uniform that had been retained by the department as part of his suspension.
This was his original badge, the one he'd been issued when he'd graduated from the police academy in 1940, the one that should have been locked in his apartment drawer. More disturbing than the presence of the badge was how it had been placed. Someone had carefully sewn it into the silk lining with precise stitches that matched the funeral home's embroidery work. The placement was reverent, respectful, almost ceremonial, as if the badge was meant to be a gift rather than a violation. Attached to the badge was a small card written in elegant handwriting. Every officer should be buried with the symbol of their greatest achievement. For Patrick O'Malley, that symbol is the reminder of what happens when authority forgets its responsibility to protect the innocent. March 25th, 1955. The NYPD launched an investigation into how O'Malley's badge had ended up in his coffin, interviewing funeral home employees, cemetery workers, and anyone who'd had access to the casket during the preparation and service. The investigation revealed nothing. The funeral home staff insisted that the badge hadn't been present when they prepared the body and sealed the coffin. The cemetery workers claimed they'd never seen it before the family requested the reopening. The badge itself showed no signs of tampering or forced entry into the coffin. Detective Captain Murphy, who'd prosecuted O'Malley and was now investigating his death, found himself facing questions that had no logical answers. How had someone obtained O'Malley's original police academy badge? How had they gained access to a sealed coffin during an active funeral service? How had they accomplished the sewing work without being observed by dozens of mourners and law enforcement personnel? The only clue was the handwriting on the card, which experts determined had been written with a fountain pen using expensive ink by someone with exceptional penmanship skills and a sophisticated vocabulary. March 30th, 1955. Detective Captain Murphy received a phone call that provided the answers he'd been seeking, but in a way that left him more confused than ever. "Captain Murphy," said a voice he recognized as belonging to Bumpy Johnson, "I understand you've been investigating how Patrick O'Malley's badge ended up in his coffin." "Mr. Johnson," Murphy replied carefully, "do you have information relevant to this investigation?" "I have information relevant to understanding why certain symbols end up in certain places when justice needs to be served," Bumpy replied. "But I'm calling to discuss something more important, the safety of pregnant women on the streets of Harlem." The conversation lasted 15 minutes. Bumpy Johnson explained that he'd heard about the investigation into O'Malley's funeral, and he wanted to make sure that Captain Murphy understood the lesson that the badge was intended to teach. "Captain, every police officer in New York needs to understand that their badge represents a responsibility to protect innocent people, especially vulnerable people like pregnant women, children, and elderly residents who can't protect themselves." "Mr. Johnson," Captain Murphy said, "are you telling me that you were involved in placing that badge in Officer O'Malley's coffin?"
Captain, I'm telling you that symbols of authority become symbols of accountability when people understand that their actions have consequences that extend beyond their lifetimes. Patrick O'Malley beat a pregnant woman with his nightstick. His badge was placed over his heart to remind him and anyone who might be inspired by his example that such behavior is inconsistent with the oath that every police officer takes to serve and protect.
Captain Murphy found himself in the strange position of investigating a crime that might not actually be a crime. No laws had been broken by placing O'Malley's badge in his coffin. No property had been stolen. The badge had belonged to O'Malley and was being buried with him. No violence had been committed. No threats had been made. No damage had been done to anyone or anything. But a message had been sent that was more powerful than any legal punishment could have been. Every police officer in New York now understood that their actions, especially their treatment of vulnerable citizens, would be remembered and accounted for in ways that extended beyond departmental discipline or criminal prosecution. April 15th, 1955. The NYPD had officially closed its investigation into Officer O'Malley's death and the appearance of his badge in his coffin, ruling both incidents as resolved without criminal implications. But the story of the badge became legendary within law enforcement circles, passed down as a cautionary tale about the long-term consequences of police brutality and the importance of remembering that authority comes with accountability. Police officers throughout the city began treating Harlem residents with more respect, not because they feared legal consequences, but because they understood that their behavior was being observed and evaluated by someone who had the ability to turn their symbols of authority into reminders of their failures. Mayme Johnson gave birth to a healthy daughter on April 22, 1955, 7 weeks after the incident on 25th Street. She never spoke publicly about the attack or her husband's response, but she continued to walk the streets of Harlem with the confidence of someone who knew that her safety was protected by more than just laws and police procedures. Bumpy Johnson never admitted to any involvement in placing O'Malley's badge in his coffin, but he also never denied the implications of what had happened. When asked by reporters about the incident, he simply said every man should be buried with the symbols that best represent his life's work. For some men, that's medals for bravery. For others, it's reminders of lessons they should have learned while they were alive. March 15th, 1955. The day a racist cop learned that beating pregnant women comes with consequences that extend beyond suspension, prosecution, or even death. The day Bumpy Johnson proved that justice doesn't always require courtrooms, judges, or legal procedures. Sometimes it just requires someone who understands how to turn symbols of authority into symbols of accountability. The day a police badge became a monument to the principle that protecting the innocent is every officer's highest duty, and failing in that duty creates obligations that last longer than any career.
Officer Patrick O'Malley thought his badge represented his authority to intimidate, control, and punish anyone he considered beneath him. Bumpy Johnson taught him and every other police officer in New York that badges represent responsibility, accountability, and the eternal obligation to protect those who cannot protect themselves.
Sometimes the most appropriate burial gift isn't flowers or prayers. Sometimes it's the symbol that reminds everyone what happens when authority forgets its purpose. A police badge over a dead man's heart. A reminder that lasted longer than the man it was meant to teach. A lesson about justice that was more powerful than any legal punishment could have been. March 15th, 1955. The day Bumpy Johnson proved that the badge doesn't make the man makes the badge. And when the man fails the badge becomes his permanent reminder of what he should have been.